The sirens were getting closer, and I could hear him screaming through the locked bedroom door, his fists pounding against the wood so hard I thought it might splinter. "You don't understand what you've done," he kept shouting, his voice cracking with something between rage and desperation. I sat on the floor of my Chicago apartment, my back against the bed, holding the envelope that contained everything: the bank statements, the forged signatures, the evidence of 5 years of lies compressed into neat little rows of numbers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers, but I couldn't let go. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about how we'd gotten here, how the man I'd promised to love forever had become this stranger trying to break down my door. But let me take you back. 3 months earlier, my life looked nothing like this chaos. 3 months earlier, I was still pretending. My name is Clara, and 5 years ago, I woke up to find my husband gone and our bank account empty. Just gone. No note. No explanation, just a gaping hole where our savings used to be, and an even bigger hole where my trust used to live. The checking account that had held $47,000, money we'd saved for years, money that was supposed to be our future, showed a balance of $112. $112 to my name, and a marriage certificate that suddenly felt like it was written in disappearing ink. I remember that morning with perfect clarity. It was a Tuesday in October, unseasonably cold for Chicago, the kind of morning where your breath makes clouds in the air even inside your apartment if the heat hasn't kicked in yet. I'd made coffee, strong and black the way Michael always liked it, and I was sitting at our kitchen table going through bills when I decided to check our account balance. Just routine, just Tuesday morning administrative tasks. The number on the screen didn't register at first. My brain literally couldn't process it. I refreshed the page 3 times, certain it was a technical error, some glitch in the bank's system. It wasn't a glitch. I called Michael's phone. Straight to voicemail. I called his office. His assistant, Karen, sounded genuinely confused. He said he was taking a few personal days, she told me, her voice careful, in that way people get when they sense they're stepping into a minefield of someone else's personal crisis. He didn't mention it to you? No, he hadn't mentioned it to me. My husband, the man who shared my bed and my life, and apparently my bank account password, hadn't mentioned that he was planning to disappear with everything we owned. I sat at that kitchen table for what must have been an hour, just staring at the screen, hitting refresh over and over, like maybe if I did it enough times, the numbers would change back. The coffee Michael would never drink went cold in its mug, a ring of condensation forming on the wood table. I remember focusing on that ring, how it was spreading, how I should get a coaster, how Michael always told me I needed to be more careful about water damage on the furniture. The absurdity of worrying about a water ring when my entire life was collapsing struck me suddenly, and I laughed. It came out wrong, sharp and slightly hysterical, echoing in the empty apartment. That's when it really hit me. The apartment was empty, not just of Michael, but of him. His laptop that usually sat on the desk in the corner, gone. His winter coat that should have been hanging by the door, gone. The expensive watch his father had given him, the one he kept in the box on his dresser, gone. I stood up so fast the chair fell backwards and I ran to our bedroom, threw open his closet. Half empty, not completely cleaned out, which somehow made it worse. He'd taken his favorite things, the clothes he actually wore, and left behind the stuff that didn't matter. Left behind just enough that it took me an hour to realize he wasn't coming back. I tore through the apartment like a tornado, opening drawers, checking shelves, looking for something, anything, that would explain this. In the back of the filing cabinet, I found a gap where our joint financial documents used to be. Birth certificates, tax returns, all gone. He'd been planning this. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, some crisis that made him panic and run. This was calculated, methodical. He'd been getting ready to leave while I slept next to him, trusting him, loving him. The next few days were a blur of police reports and bank investigations and well-meaning friends who kept saying things like, "There must be some explanation," and "I'm sure he'll come back." I wanted to scream at them. What explanation could possibly justify this? What rational human being drains their joint account and vanishes without a word? But I didn't scream. I nodded and smiled weakly and told everyone I was sure it would be fine, that there was probably just some terrible misunderstanding. I know you're probably yelling at your screen right now, telling me to wake up, to see the truth. But here's the thing about love and trust. When they're woven into the fabric of your daily life, when they're as routine as your morning coffee, you can't just rip them out without tearing yourself apart in the process. The police were sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. "It's a civil matter," they told me. "Joint account means joint access. Unless you can prove coercion or fraud, there's nothing criminal here." I remember the officer who took my statement, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform. He'd seen this before, I could tell. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "I'm going to level with you. Unless your husband did something explicitly illegal, and accessing a joint account, even if it feels wrong, isn't illegal, there's not much we can do. You can file a missing persons report, but he's an adult who left of his own volition. He took his own belongings. He didn't break any laws we can prove." "He stole from me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He withdrew from a joint account," the officer corrected gently. "In the eyes of the law, that money was as much his as yours. I'm sorry. I really am. But your best bet is to get a lawyer and pursue this civilly." "A lawyer? With what money? The $112 in my account?" I wanted to laugh again, that same hysterical edge threatening to bubble up. The bank said essentially the same thing. I spent 3 hours at the branch, talking to increasingly senior people, each one more apologetic and less helpful than the last. The money was gone, transferred to an account I'd never heard of, and because both our names were on the original account, the transaction was technically legal. Technically legal. Those 2 words became the soundtrack of my nightmares. But then came the second blow, the one that somehow hurt even more than the empty bank account. About a week after Michael disappeared, I started getting phone calls. First from my sister, then from my best friend Laura, then from people I barely knew from our church. Everyone wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed help managing my spending problem. My spending problem. I didn't understand what they were talking about until Laura finally told me straight. We met at a coffee shop near her office, one of those deliberately rustic places with exposed brick and reclaimed wood tables. I got there first, ordered a tea I couldn't really afford, and waited. When Laura arrived, I could see the discomfort on her face before she even sat down. "Clara," she started, then stopped, tried again. "Honey, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "Just tell me," I said. I was so tired of bad news, of surprises, of my life being something that happened to me instead of something I had any control over. "Michael has been talking to people," she said carefully, "before he left, maybe even for weeks before. He's been saying things about you." My stomach dropped. What kind of things? Laura pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then slid it across the table to me. It was a screenshot of a Facebook message from Michael to a mutual friend named Beth. The message was long, detailed, full of concern and frustration. In it, Michael described a wife spiraling out of control, maxing out credit cards on things they didn't need, hiding purchases, getting defensive when confronted. He talked about finding receipts for thousands of dollars in purchases I'd hidden from him. He mentioned looking into addiction counseling, wondering if my shopping problem was really a deeper psychological issue. None of it was true. None of it. But it was so specific, so detailed, so heartfelt in its concern that reading it, I almost believed him myself, almost wondered if I had done these things and somehow forgotten. "There's more," Laura said quietly. He showed people credit card statements. Proof, he said, of your spending. I don't have any credit cards except the one joint one we barely use, I said. But my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. I know, Laura said. She reached across the table and took my hand. I know, Clara. I know you, but he was very convincing, and now that he's gone, people are assuming. That I pushed him to it, I finished. That my out-of-control spending made him desperate enough to leave. I don't think that, Laura said fiercely. I want you to know that. I don't believe a word of it. But Clara, honey, you need to know what people are saying. You need to be prepared. The brilliance of it was sickening. When he finally disappeared with the money, people didn't wonder what he'd done. They assumed I'd finally pushed him too far, that he'd had to protect himself from my destructive habits. I became the villain in my own life story, and he became the victim. I tried to defend myself, to explain that none of it was true, but how do you prove a negative? How do you prove you didn't do something when the evidence of your innocence is just the absence of evidence of guilt? Every conversation became an exercise in humiliation. I could see it in people's eyes, the doubt, the pity, the quiet judgment. They wanted to believe me, some of them, but Michael had been so thorough, so convincing. My sister Rachel believed me without question. Thank God for that. She came over the night after my coffee with Laura, bringing groceries she knew I couldn't afford, and a fury on my behalf that was almost comforting in its intensity. He's a monster, she said, slamming cans of soup into my pantry with more force than necessary. An absolute monster. Who does this to someone? Who plans something like this? I don't know, I said. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket even though the apartment wasn't cold. I couldn't seem to get warm those days. I keep trying to figure out when it started. When did he decide to do this? Was he planning it when we got married? Or did something change? Did I do something that made him— Stop, Rachel cut me off sharply. Stop that right now. This is not your fault. Not even a little bit. This is him. This is all him. Then why? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Why would he do this? Rachel came and sat next to me, put her arm around my shoulders. I don't know, sweetie. I don't know. But we're going to figure it out. We're going to get through this. But figuring it out seemed impossible when I couldn't even manage basic things like paying rent or buying groceries. Rachel helped where she could, but she had her own family, her own responsibilities. My parents were retired, living on a fixed income in Florida. They offered to help, but I knew they didn't have much to spare. I was 38 years old, and I was having to ask my elderly parents for money to buy food. I stopped going to church. I stopped answering the phone unless it was from one of the few people I knew absolutely believed me. I started shopping at a grocery store across town because I couldn't stand the looks I got at our usual place, the whispers that followed me down the aisles. One day, about 3 weeks after Michael left, I ran into his mother at the grocery store. I'd been avoiding her calls, couldn't face the conversation I knew we needed to have. But there she was, in the produce section, and there was nowhere to hide. "Clara," she said, and her voice was cold, in a way I'd never heard before. Margaret had always been kind to me, welcoming, warm. Now she looked at me like I was something distasteful she'd found stuck to her shoe. "Hi, Margaret," I managed. "I spoke with Michael," she said. "No preamble, no how are you doing. He told me what's been going on. I have to say, I'm very disappointed." The floor felt unsteady beneath my feet. "He called you? When? Where is he?" "He's taking some time to figure things out," she said, examining a tomato with intense focus so she didn't have to look at me. "After everything you put him through, I think he deserves that, don't you?" "Margaret, whatever he told you, it's not true." "I didn't. My son wouldn't lie to me," she interrupted, finally meeting my eyes. The coldness there stole my breath. "I know you've been having problems. I know about the spending, the hiding things from him. Michael tried so hard to help you, Clara. He tried to be patient, to be understanding. But everyone has their limit. There was no spending, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. There was no problem. He made it up. All of it. He took our money and he left, and now he's lying about why. I think you need help, Margaret said, not unkindly, but with the kind of pity that felt worse than anger. Professional help, Clara. I hope you'll consider getting it. She walked away, left me standing there in the produce section with tears streaming down my face and other shoppers pretending not to notice. Michael had even turned his own mother against me. How could I fight that? How could I prove my innocence when the person who'd framed me had spent years building credibility, building relationships, creating a version of events that everyone was ready to believe? At night, alone in our apartment, my apartment now, I guess, though the landlord was starting to make noises about next month's rent, I would replay our last real conversation, searching for clues I'd missed. It had been so mundane. We'd talked about weekend plans, about whether to get Thai food or Italian for dinner, about a funny thing his co-worker had said. Normal couple things. There had been no dramatic speeches, no cryptic warnings. He'd kissed me goodbye that Friday morning, told me he loved me, and walked out the door like he'd done 1,000 times before. Except that time, he never came back. I want you to understand something about betrayal this deep. It doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your sense of reality. I started doubting everything, questioning my own memories, my own perceptions. Had there been signs? Had I been willfully blind? Or had he really been that good at pretending? At living a double life so seamlessly that even the person sharing his bed couldn't see the truth? The thing that kept me going in those early weeks was spite, pure, burning spite. Michael wanted me to crumble, to validate his narrative of the unstable wife who couldn't handle her own life. Every fiber of my being wanted to prove him wrong, to rise above his lies and show the world who I really was. But spite only gets you so far. And I was so tired. I remember the exact moment I stopped baking. It was a Sunday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Michael left. For 20 years of our marriage, Sunday morning had been my sacred time. I would wake up early, put on music, and spend 3 hours making pies from scratch. Apple, cherry, pecan, whatever fruit was in season. It was meditative, that process of measuring and mixing and rolling out dough. My hands knew the work so well, I barely had to think about it. And in that thoughtlessness, I found peace. Michael used to joke that he married me for my pies. On our third date, I'd brought a cherry pie to a picnic, and he'd eaten almost half of it by himself. "Marry me," he'd said, mouth full, grinning like a kid. I'd laughed, thought he was kidding. 3 months later, when he actually proposed, he'd brought a ring and a cherry pie. "I was serious before," he'd said. "Anyone who can make something this perfect has to be in my life forever." I thought it was romantic. Now I wondered if even that had been calculated, part of the long con of making me trust him completely. That Sunday, I woke up and went to the kitchen like always. I pulled out my mixing bowls and measuring cups. I opened the pantry and looked at the bags of flour and sugar, and I just stood there, unable to move, unable to remember why this had ever mattered to me. The silence in the kitchen was suffocating. No music playing, no Michael reading the paper at the table, no warmth from the oven filling the space. Just me, alone, with mixing bowls that suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. I put everything away and went back to bed. I didn't bake again for almost 5 years. The weeks blurred into months. I found work as a substitute teacher, took on freelance editing jobs, cobbled together enough income to keep the apartment and feed myself. The substitute teaching was sporadic and unpredictable. Some weeks I worked 4 days, some weeks none at all. I'd wake up at 5:30 every morning, check my phone to see if I'd gotten called for an assignment, and most days I'd just stare at the blank notification screen, then force myself to get up anyway. Those mornings were the hardest. The apartment was so quiet without Michael. No sound of him in the shower, no smell of his cologne, no rustling of his newspaper, just silence and the awareness of my own breathing. I'd make coffee for one, sit at the kitchen table that felt too big for just me, and try to plan my day around the possibility of not having any work, any income, any purpose. The substitute teaching was a special kind of torture. I'd show up at a school where no one knew my story, smile at students who saw me as just another temp, and try to follow lesson plans left by teachers who had their lives together. During lunch breaks, I'd sit alone in the staff room, scrolling through my bank account, calculating how many more weeks I could survive if work stayed this sparse. The other teachers would chat about their weekends, their families, their vacation plans, and I'd nod along, pretending I had any of those things. There was one school I returned to frequently, a middle school on the south side. The principal, Mrs. Washington, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who seemed to see through my carefully constructed facade. One day, after I'd covered a particularly difficult 7th grade class, she called me into her office. "You're good with the kids," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Patient, kind. They respond to you." "Thank you," I said, wondering if this was leading to a permanent position, mentally calculating whether I could afford to hope for that. "But you're sad," she continued, catching me completely off guard. "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can tell when someone's just going through the motions. Whatever you're dealing with, don't let it make you forget who you are." I didn't know what to say to that. How could I explain that I wasn't sure I knew who I was anymore? That the person I'd been, Michael's wife, the woman who made pies on Sunday mornings, the woman who believed in love and trust and happily ever after, that person was gone, and I didn't know who was left in her place. "Thank you," I said again, and left before she could see me cry. The editing work came through a connection of Rachel's, a textbook company that needed copy editors. The pay was terrible, and the work was mind-numbing, reading the same dry paragraphs about photosynthesis or the Civil War over and over, marking typos and formatting errors. But it was something I could do from home, in my pajamas, at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, and it paid. Not much, but enough to matter when every dollar counted. I'd sit at my laptop in the middle of the night, the blue light harsh on my tired eyes, correcting someone else's words while my own story remained untold. Sometimes I'd find myself crying without quite knowing why, tears dripping onto my keyboard as I fixed a comma splice or corrected a dangling modifier. The work required just enough attention to keep me from thinking about my own life, but not enough to feel fulfilling. It was perfect, in its way. Empty work for an empty life. My diet consisted mainly of pasta, rice, and whatever vegetables were on sale. I learned to make one chicken breast last for 3 meals. I stopped buying coffee and started making it at home. I cut my own hair. Every expense was scrutinized, every purchase weighed against the dwindling balance in my account. I kept a spreadsheet, tracking every penny, terrified of the day when the numbers would finally run out. There were moments of unexpected kindness that kept me afloat. Rachel would accidentally make too much dinner and bring me leftovers. Laura would find me at the end of every month with a random gift card to the grocery store. My downstairs neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who I barely knew, started leaving bags of produce outside my door with notes that said things like, "Too much from the farmer's market." I knew what they were doing. I knew they felt sorry for me, and I was grateful and humiliated in equal measure. I existed. That's the best word for it. I wasn't living, wasn't thriving, wasn't healing. I was just existing, day after day, waiting for something to change. During this time, I developed rituals to get through each day. Every morning, no matter how little sleep I'd gotten, I'd shower and get dressed in real clothes, even if I had nowhere to go. It was a way of telling myself I still mattered, that I hadn't completely given up. I'd take walks around my neighborhood, watching other people live their lives, couples holding hands, families laughing together, people who seemed to trust that tomorrow would come and it would be okay. I started going to a support group for people dealing with financial stress. It was held every Tuesday evening in the basement of a community center, and the first time I went, I almost turned around and left. But something made me stay. The facilitator, a woman named Teresa who'd gone through bankruptcy after a medical crisis, welcomed me warmly. There were about 8 people in the group, all dealing with different crises, all trying to rebuild their lives from financial ruin. I didn't talk much at first. I'd sit in the circle of metal folding chairs, listening to other people's stories, and feel both less alone and more ashamed. At least their crises had been accidents, medical emergencies, job losses, things outside their control. Mine was personal. Mine was betrayal. Mine meant I'd been stupid enough to trust someone who'd been planning to destroy me all along. But slowly, over weeks, I started to talk. Started to tell my story in small pieces, and the group listened without judgment, without the doubt I'd seen in so many other eyes. They believed me. They understood that financial abuse was real, that it was devastating, that it wasn't my fault. That validation, small as it might seem, started to rebuild something in me that Michael had broken. And then, 4.5 years later, something did. I need you to understand the context of what happened next. By that point, I'd built a small, quiet life for myself. I'd made peace, or something like it, with the fact that I would probably never know why Michael had done what he did. I'd accepted that the money was gone and wasn't coming back. I'd even started to rebuild my reputation, slowly, one genuine conversation at a time, with people who bothered to get to know the real me instead of the caricature Michael had created. I wasn't happy exactly, but I wasn't miserable anymore either. I'd found a kind of equilibrium. And then my niece got engaged. Sarah was my older sister's daughter, a bright, funny woman in her late 20s who'd found love with a genuinely good man named David. The engagement party was planned for a Saturday in June at a restaurant downtown. Nothing too fancy, but nice enough, with about 60 guests expected. My sister called to make sure I was coming, and I promised I would. Family was important. Family had stood by me when everything else fell apart. I bought a new dress, got my hair done, practiced my smile in the mirror. I was determined to show up and be present, to celebrate Sarah's happiness without letting my own history cast a shadow on her day. The party was lovely. Sarah was radiant, David was attentive and kind, and the room was full of laughter and joy. I found myself actually relaxing, actually enjoying the moment, feeling more like my old self than I had in years. And then I saw the photo. It was posted to the restaurant's Instagram account, one of those candid shots they take to promote their venue. The caption was something generic about love and celebration, and there were probably 20 people visible in the frame, all blurred into the background of the happy couple in the center. But I wasn't looking at the happy couple. I was looking at a man in the back corner of the photo, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize, both of them laughing at something off camera. The man was Michael, my husband, my vanished, money-stealing, reputation-destroying husband. Just there, existing. At the same restaurant, on the same night, in the same city, like none of it had ever happened. The room started spinning. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and tried to remember how to breathe. 5 years of wondering and waiting and trying to understand, and he was just here, in Chicago, looking healthy and happy and completely unbothered by the wreckage he'd left behind. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and looked at the photo again, zooming in until I could see his face clearly. There was no doubt. It was him. Older, maybe, with a little more gray at the temples, but unmistakably him. And the woman next to him wore a ring on her left hand that caught the light in the photo, a diamond that probably cost more than what he'd stolen from our account. The betrayal I'd thought I'd made peace with came roaring back, fresh and raw and absolutely overwhelming. But underneath it, underneath the hurt and the anger, was something else, something colder and sharper. Curiosity. How had he done this? How had he built a whole new life, apparently in the same city where he'd destroyed his old one? And more importantly, how had he gotten away with it? I made it through the rest of the party on autopilot, hugging Sarah, congratulating David, making small talk with relatives. But inside, my mind was racing. I needed to know more. I needed to understand. And maybe, just maybe, I needed him to face some consequences for what he'd done. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind cataloging everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. The photo had been taken at a public place, which meant Michael wasn't hiding. He was living his life openly, confidently, like he had nothing to fear, which raised the question, why would he be afraid? The police had said what he did was technically legal. The statute of limitations on any civil claims had probably run out years ago. He'd gotten away with it, free and clear, unless someone made him face it, unless someone refused to let it go. I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if revenge is really the answer, if holding on to anger for 5 years is healthy, if I should just let it go and move on. And maybe you're right. Maybe the wise thing, the evolved thing, would be to accept that some questions don't have answers and some wrongs never get made right. But here's what I learned in those 5 years of quiet suffering. Sometimes the only person who can give you justice is yourself. Sometimes the closure you're waiting for isn't going to come from an apology or an explanation. Sometimes you have to create your own ending to the story. And I was tired of being the victim in someone else's narrative. The next morning, I started my research. I created fake social media accounts and began following the threads. It took me 3 days just to find enough information to confirm the woman's identity. I started with the restaurant's location tag, cross-referenced it with the timestamp on the photo, searched through public posts from that night. Finally, I found a photo posted by someone else at a different table, and in the background I could see them again. This time, someone had tagged the woman. Jennifer Hartwell. The name meant nothing to me, but Google had plenty to say about her. The woman in the photo was named Jennifer, and according to her very public Instagram profile, she and Michael, though she called him Mike, had been together for 4 years. They lived in a condo in Lincoln Park, had a golden retriever named Biscuit, and enjoyed weekend trips to Michigan wine country. 4 years. He'd been with her for 4 years, which meant he'd started that relationship less than a year after leaving me. While I was still fielding phone calls about my fictional spending problems, while I was eating ramen for dinner because I could barely afford groceries, he was building a new life with someone else, using what I can only assume was our money to fund it. But here's where it got interesting. I started digging into Jennifer's background, and I found something that made all the pieces click into place. Jennifer worked in wealth management at a boutique firm downtown. Not just worked there. She was a partner, owned a significant chunk of the company. She came from money, old Chicago money, the kind where your great-grandfather's name is on a building somewhere. Her LinkedIn profile was extensive. MBA from Northwestern, 15 years in financial services, multiple awards for top performance, board member of 3 charitable foundations, photos from galas and fundraisers, always in designer gowns, always perfectly polished. Michael hadn't just left me. He'd traded up. He'd found someone with more money, better connections, a higher social status. I was the rough draft, and Jennifer was the final version. The cold rage that had been building in my chest crystallized into something harder, something with edges. This wasn't just about getting my money back anymore. This was about making him face the truth of what he'd done, about stripping away the comfortable new life he'd built on the foundation of my suffering. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering information. I learned that Jennifer's firm was hosting a charity gala in a month, a black tie event at the Four Seasons that would be attended by half of Chicago's financial elite. I learned that Mike, was listed as her +1 on the event page. I learned that the gala had a silent auction component and that anyone could register to bid as long as they bought a ticket. A ticket cost $500, which was more than I had in my account. But my sister, when I told her what I'd discovered, insisted on lending me the money. "Are you sure?" I asked her. We were sitting in her kitchen, her kids at school, her husband at work. She'd made tea and put cookies on a plate between us, like we were having a casual visit instead of plotting what amounted to a confrontation 5 years in the making. "Am I sure?" Rachel repeated, her voice rising. "Clara, are you seriously asking me that? After what he did to you? After the lies he told? The way he turned people against you? The way he stole everything and just walked away?" "Yes, I'm sure. I'm going to give you the money, and you're going to go to that gala, and you're going to make him face what he did." "What if it backfires?" I asked quietly. "What if he makes me look crazy again? What if Jennifer believes him instead of me?" Rachel reached across the table and gripped my hand hard. "Then at least you tried. At least you didn't let him get away with it without saying anything. Clara, you've spent 5 years being quiet, being the victim, letting his version of events stand unchallenged. Don't you think it's time you got to tell your side of the story?" She was right. Of course she was right. "Make him pay," she said, her voice fierce. "Whatever you're planning, make him pay for what he did to you." I bought the ticket. I bought a dress, black and elegant, and exactly the kind of thing the old Clara, the pre-betrayal Clara, would have worn. It hung in my closet for 2 weeks, still in its garment bag, a physical reminder of what I was about to do. Sometimes I'd open the closet just to look at it, to remind myself that this was real, that I was actually going to do this. I made an appointment to get my hair and makeup done at a salon I couldn't really afford, but Rachel insisted on paying for. "You're going to walk in there looking like the queen you are," she said. "You're going to look him in the eye and remind him that you survived, that you're still here and he didn't break you." But had he broken me? I looked at myself in the mirror and wasn't sure I recognized the woman looking back. 5 years of poverty and grief and shame had carved themselves into my face. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, gray in my hair I hadn't bothered to cover. I looked older, harder, sadder. I looked like someone who'd been through something terrible and hadn't quite made it out the other side. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror, rehearsing the speech I would give when I finally confronted him. The words felt clumsy in my mouth at first, too angry, then too meek, then too theatrical. I must have started over 100 times, trying to find the right tone, dignified but fierce, hurt but strong, vulnerable but unbreakable. "Hello, Michael," I'd say to my reflection. "Remember me? Your wife? The woman whose life you destroyed?" No, too bitter. "I just wanted you to know that I survived, that I'm still here. Too weak. You owe me an explanation. Too passive. I didn't want anything from him. I wasn't there to get answers. I was there to give them." The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. What if he really didn't remember me? What if seeing him face to face broke something in me that I couldn't put back together? What if I got there and couldn't go through with it, couldn't say the words, couldn't face him? At 3 a.m, I got up and made tea, sat at my kitchen table in the dark. The same table where I'd discovered the empty bank account. The same table where I'd paid bills with money I didn't have. The same table where I'd cried so many tears I was surprised the wood hadn't warped from the moisture. I thought about calling it off. I could just not go. I could take the dress back, get a refund, use the money for something practical like groceries or rent. I could let Michael continue his perfect life, and I could continue my small, quiet one. We could both just move on, pretend the other didn't exist. But that's what he wanted. That's what he'd always wanted. For me to disappear, to be erased, to become nothing more than a footnote in his history. A mistake he'd corrected, a problem he'd solved. And I was so tired of being nothing. But as the gala got closer, doubt started creeping in. What was I actually going to accomplish? Public humiliation? A scene? Would anyone even believe me? Or would I just look like a crazy ex-wife making unfounded accusations? Michael had proven, 5 years ago, that he was very good at controlling narratives, at making himself the victim and me the villain. I talked it through with the support group the Tuesday before the gala. Teresa and the others listened as I described my plan, my fears, my doubts. "What do you want to get out of this?" Teresa asked gently. "What does success look like for you?" I thought about it. "I want him to see me," I said finally. "I want him to acknowledge what he did. I want him to know that I know the truth." "And if he doesn't?" Another group member, a man named David who'd been financially abused by his business partner, asked. "If he denies it all, if he makes you look crazy, if nothing changes?" "Then at least I told the truth," I said. "At least I tried. At least I stopped being silent." They all nodded. They understood. They'd all been there. At that crossroads between accepting injustice and fighting back, knowing that fighting back might hurt even more than staying quiet. I needed something concrete, something undeniable, something that would make it impossible for him to lie his way out of the truth. That's when I remembered the email. Back when Michael first disappeared, I'd tried to access our old email account, the one we'd shared for household administrative stuff. He'd changed the password, locked me out completely. But I still had the login information written down in an old planner, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been lazy about security. People rarely change their security questions, their backup emails, the digital infrastructure they build their lives on. It took me 3 days and about a dozen attempts, but I got in. And there, in the archived folders, was everything. Emails to Jennifer from 6 months before he left me, making plans, talking about their future together. Emails to a lawyer about the best way to protect assets in an anticipated divorce. Emails to financial advisors about moving money into offshore accounts where it would be harder to trace. One email in particular made my blood run cold. It was to someone named Rick, apparently a friend from college, dated 8 months before Michael disappeared. "I know it sounds harsh," Michael had written, "but I've been stuck in this marriage for years, and Clara is never going to be what I need. She's content with her little life, her little job, her little hobbies. I need more than that. Jennifer gets it. She's ambitious, successful, connected. With her, I can actually be someone. The trick is getting out clean, and I think I have a plan for that. Make Clara look unstable, establish a pattern of financial irresponsibility, then take the money and go. By the time she figures out what happened, I'll be settled in my new life, and there won't be anything she can do about it. Legally, it's all above board. Joint account, joint access. And socially, well, no one's going to believe the crazy wife with the spending problem over the concerned husband who finally had enough. He'd planned it, all of it, for months, maybe longer. Every morning when he'd kissed me goodbye, every night when he'd told me he loved me, he'd been methodically planning how to destroy my life and build a new one. I downloaded everything. I organized it into folders, created a timeline, built a case file that would make any prosecutor weep. And then I printed copies, put them in a folder, and waited for the night of the gala. The Four Seasons was exactly as elegant as I'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, people in designer clothes making small talk about market trends and portfolio diversification. I felt like an alien in this world, even though I was dressed the part. These weren't my people. They'd never been my people. The ballroom was enormous, draped in cream and gold, with round tables set for 10 positioned around a parquet dance floor. A string quartet played something classical and soothing in one corner. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked more like art than food. Everyone was beautiful, polished, comfortable in their wealth, in a way I'd never be even if I had all the money in the world. I spotted Michael almost immediately. He was standing by the bar, Jennifer on his arm, both of them laughing with a group of other couples. He looked good, happy, like he didn't have a care in the world, like he hadn't destroyed someone's life to get here. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit perfectly, probably tailored. His hair was styled, that gray at his temples making him look distinguished rather than old. He held a glass of what was probably expensive scotch, and when he laughed at something someone said, he threw his head back in that way he used to do with me, uninhibited and genuine seeming. Jennifer was stunning. I hated that I noticed, hated that I compared myself to her, but I did. She wore a floor-length gown in deep emerald green that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, diamond earrings catching the light every time she moved. She had one hand on Michael's arm, possessive and comfortable, the gesture of someone who'd never had reason to doubt her place in someone's life. I watched them for a while, working up my courage, reminding myself why I was here. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. He looked right at me. Our eyes met across the room, and there was no recognition. No shock, no guilt, no fear. Just polite blankness. The look you give a stranger at a cocktail party before you glance away and continue your conversation. He didn't remember me, or he was pretending not to. Either way, the message was clear. I didn't matter. I had never mattered. I was so inconsequential to him that 5 years later he could look right at me and feel nothing. That should have devastated me. Instead, it set me free. I walked up to their group, my heart pounding, but my hands steady. Jennifer saw me first, gave me that polite Chicago smile, the one that says, "I don't know you, but I'm going to be gracious about it." "Hi," I said, keeping my voice light and friendly. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I just had to come over and say hello." I turned to Michael, watched his face carefully. "It's been so long. How have you been, Michael?" I saw it then, the flicker of recognition, the momentary widening of his eyes before he caught himself. His hand tightened on his glass, his smile going rigid at the corners. But he recovered quickly, that charming smile sliding back into place like a mask he'd practiced wearing. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I think you might have me confused with someone else. I'm Mike." He gestured to Jennifer. "This is my fiancée, Jennifer. Fiancée, not wife." After 4 years together, he still hadn't married her. Interesting. "Oh my God," I said, laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. "You're right. I am so sorry. You just look exactly like someone I used to know. The resemblance is uncanny." I watched relief wash over his face. He thought I was going to let it go, going to slink away and let him continue his perfect evening. I let him think that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I pulled out my phone and opened it to a photo. "This is so weird," I said, showing it to Jennifer. "This is the guy I'm thinking of. Don't they look identical?" It was our wedding photo. Michael and me, young and happy and stupidly in love, on what was supposed to be the beginning of our forever. Jennifer's smile froze. She looked at the photo, then at Michael, then back at the photo. I could see her mind working, processing the image. The same face, younger but unmistakable, in a tuxedo not unlike the one he wore now, standing next to a woman in a white dress who was clearly not a sister or a friend. "Mike?" Her voice was uncertain, questioning. "What is this?" "I have no idea," Michael said quickly. His voice was smooth, but I could hear the edge of panic underneath. "Like I said, I've never seen this woman before in my life." "Really?" I asked. I kept my tone pleasant, conversational, like we were discussing the weather, because I have about 300 emails that suggest otherwise. Want me to read a few? There's a particularly good one from March 15th, 5 years ago, where you told someone named Jennifer, I looked at her pointedly, that you couldn't wait to start your life together once you'd taken care of your financial obligations. The color drained from Michael's face. Jennifer took a step back, her hand falling away from his arm. The other people in their group had gone silent, watching this unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car crash. "Who is she?" Jennifer asked Michael, her voice shaking. "Mike, who is this woman?" "I'm his wife," I said simply. Or I was anyway, until he drained our bank account and disappeared 5 years ago. The police told me I couldn't press charges because it was technically legal. But you know what's not legal. I looked directly at Michael. "Forging signatures on financial documents, which is what you did when you transferred money into that offshore account in the Caymans. I have the documents, I have the emails, I have everything." Michael had gone from pale to gray. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. I'd never seen him speechless before. In all our years together, he'd always had something to say, always had an explanation, a justification, a smooth response to deflect and redirect. Now he just stood there, exposed, with nowhere to hide. "You're lying," Jennifer said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She was looking at Michael, watching him fail to defend himself, and I could see her mind working, putting pieces together, probably remembering odd things he'd said or done that suddenly made sense in this new context. "I'm really not," I said. I pulled the folder from my purse and handed it to her. "It's all in here. Bank statements, emails, even the fake credit card bills he created to convince everyone I had a spending problem. You seem like a smart woman, Jennifer. You work in wealth management. You know what financial fraud looks like." She took the folder with trembling hands. Michael tried to grab it from her, but she jerked away. "Don't," she said, her voice hard. "Don't touch me." The scene was starting to attract attention. Other gala attendees were glancing over, whispering to each other. A man who I would later learn was Jennifer's business partner started walking toward us, concern on his face. "Jennifer?" Michael started. "Sweetheart, let me explain." "Explain what?" she demanded. Her voice was rising now, that polished composure cracking. "Explain that you lied to me? That you're married? That everything about us is built on fraud?" "I'm not married," he said desperately. "I mean, I was, but it's been 5 years. It's over. It doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter." I laughed, and it came out sharp and brittle. "You stole $47,000 from me. You destroyed my reputation. You made me believe I was losing my mind. And it doesn't matter?" Jennifer's business partner had reached us now, and he was looking between all of us, trying to understand the situation. He was an older man, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Jennifer, is everything okay?" "No," she said quietly. She was still looking at Michael, but I could see her expression shifting, hardening. "No, everything is very much not okay." She turned to her partner. "Robert, could you please call security? I'd like this man removed from the premises." "Wait," Michael said, panic creeping into his voice now. "Jenny, please, just let me explain." "My name is Jennifer," she said coldly. "And we're done. We are absolutely done." She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite gratitude, but was close. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for telling me." Security arrived. Michael tried to argue, tried to stay, tried to maintain some shred of dignity, but they were polite and firm, and within minutes he was being escorted out. He kept trying to talk, to explain, But no one was listening. The last thing I heard him say was, "I can explain everything," called back over his shoulder to Jennifer, who had turned away and wasn't listening. The remaining guests tried to pretend nothing had happened. But the energy of the evening had shifted irrevocably. Conversations became muted, uncomfortable. People kept glancing over at Jennifer, at me, whispering behind their champagne flutes. I found myself standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, still holding my clutch purse, feeling strangely empty. I'd done it. I'd confronted him, exposed him, destroyed his carefully constructed new life, just like he'd destroyed mine. So why didn't I feel better? Jennifer found me about 20 minutes later. I was standing on the terrace, looking out at the Chicago skyline, trying to process what had just happened. The night air was cool, a relief after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. City lights stretched out in every direction, millions of lives being lived, millions of stories I'd never know. Somewhere out there, Michael was probably in a cab or an Uber, his perfect evening ruined, his perfect life unraveling. I should have felt triumphant. I felt hollow. She came and stood next to me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. She'd taken off her heels and was holding them in one hand, the folder I'd given her in the other. Up close, I could see that her makeup was smudged, that she'd been crying. "The documents are real," she said finally. "I've seen enough financial fraud in my career to recognize the patterns. He forged your signature multiple times." I nodded. I'd known that, but having someone else confirm it, someone with expertise, made it feel more real somehow. "I'm going to help you," she continued. "I have lawyers, good ones, and they can pursue this. Statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud that was actively concealed. You might actually be able to get your money back." That surprised me. "Why would you help me?" She was quiet for a moment, staring out at the skyline. "Because he lied to me too," she said. "For 4 years, he lied to me. About who he was, where he came from, all of it. I thought I knew him." She laughed bitterly. "I was going to marry him. We were planning a wedding for next spring. I'd already put down deposits on venues, hired a planner. My mother was so happy. She kept saying how Mike was exactly the kind of man she'd always hoped I'd find." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. She was a victim too, in her own way. Different from me, certainly, but still someone Michael had used and deceived. "Don't be," she said. "Better to find out now than after I'd legally tied myself to him." She paused. "Did you love him when you were married?" "I thought I did," I said. "But I don't think I loved who he actually was. I loved who I thought he was, which is kind of the same as loving nobody at all." She nodded slowly. Yeah, that makes sense." She turned to look at me directly. "What was he like? With you, I mean. Was he always like this?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself 1,000 times. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent 5 years trying to figure out when the lies started. Were there signs I missed? Or was he just that good at pretending? I honestly can't tell anymore." "He told me his parents were dead," Jennifer said quietly. "Car accident when he was in college. He said he didn't like to talk about it because it was too painful." "His parents live in Arizona," I said. "They retired there about 10 years ago. They grow citrus trees in their backyard." Jennifer closed her eyes. "Of course they do." She laughed again. That same bitter sound. "God, I'm such an idiot." "You're not," I said firmly. "He's good at this. Really good. You can't blame yourself for believing someone who lied professionally." We stood there together, 2 women who'd been betrayed by the same man, watching the city lights blur and sparkle in the distance. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was understanding. And sometimes that's enough. The legal process that followed was long and complicated and exhausting. Jennifer's lawyers were as good as she'd promised, and they found holes in Michael's story big enough to drive a truck through. Turns out he'd been running similar scams for years, using different names, different identities, always finding women with money or resources he could exploit. There were 3 other women before me, they discovered. 3 other relationships where he'd taken money and disappeared, though none as extensively planned as what he'd done to me. The lawyers found patterns, traced accounts, connected dots that showed a decade-long history of fraud and manipulation. The prosecutors were interested, very interested. Fraud on that scale, across multiple victims. With forged documents and offshore accounts, that was serious federal crime territory. Michael was arrested about 3 weeks after the gala, charged with fraud, identity theft, and a handful of other crimes I didn't fully understand. He tried to call me from jail. I didn't answer. There was nothing he could say that I needed to hear. But he left a voicemail. Against my better judgment, I listened to it. "Clara," his voice said, and he sounded tired, defeated. Nothing like the confident man I'd known. "I know you're not going to pick up. I know you probably never want to hear from me again. But I need you to understand something. I never meant to hurt you. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. You were good to me. You were kind and loyal, and you deserved better than what I did. But I felt trapped, Clara. Trapped in a life that was too small for what I wanted to be. And instead of being honest about that, instead of just leaving like an adult, I took the coward's way out. I told myself I deserved that money because I'd earned it too. And I told myself you'd be fine. That you were resourceful and would land on your feet. I told myself a lot of lies, I guess. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything, that it doesn't fix what I did. But I am sorry. I deleted the message. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need him to explain himself. His reasons didn't matter, didn't change anything. He'd made his choices. Now he had to live with the consequences. The trial took almost a year. Preparing for it consumed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were depositions, meetings with prosecutors, endless reviews of documents and timelines. Jennifer's lawyers were thorough, almost obsessive in their preparation. They wanted to make sure Michael couldn't slip through any cracks, couldn't find any loopholes to escape through. I had to testify, had to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst period of my life while Michael sat at the defense table looking nothing like the confident, charming man I'd married. He looked small, diminished, like the truth of who he really was had finally caught up with the mask he'd been wearing. He wouldn't look at me during my testimony. He stared at the table in front of him, his jaw clenched. His hands folded so tightly, his knuckles were white. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Amanda Chen, walked me through everything. The morning I discovered the empty account, the phone calls from people telling me about my spending problem, the months of poverty and shame. She made me describe it all in detail, made me relive every humiliating moment in front of a courtroom full of strangers. "And during all of this," she asked, her voice gentle but firm, "did you at any point have access to the $47,000 that was taken from your joint account?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Did you at any point give your husband permission to withdraw that money?" "No." "Did you at any point know about the offshore accounts he'd opened?" "No, I didn't know any of it." Michael's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive during cross-examination, as an ex-wife with an axe to grind. He was a slick man in an expensive suit, the kind who smiled while he tried to destroy you. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Hayes, that you confronted my client at a public event specifically to humiliate him?" "I confronted him to tell the truth," I corrected, "to show his fiancée who he really was." "But you chose a public venue, didn't you? A charity gala where he would be surrounded by his partner's colleagues and friends. That seems calculated, doesn't it?" "What Michael did to me was calculated," I said, meeting his eyes. "What I did was honest." He tried other angles, tried to suggest I was exaggerating the financial hardship, that I could have asked my family for more help, that I was playing the victim for sympathy. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the fake documents he'd created, the offshore accounts, the testimonies from the other victims. 3 women who came forward after the arrest, women who'd been through their own versions of my nightmare. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who'd been with Michael in his 20s, testified about how he'd convinced her to invest her inheritance in a business opportunity that didn't exist. She'd lost almost $60,000 before he disappeared. Another woman, Michelle, described a similar pattern: the charming courtship, the quick commitment, the gradual takeover of finances, then the carefully orchestrated exit that left her broke and blamed. Listening to their stories was surreal. The details were different, but the pattern was identical. Michael had been doing this for years, decades maybe, perfecting his con, finding women to exploit and discard. I'd thought I was special, that our love had been real even if the ending was betrayal. But I wasn't special. I was just another Mark, another woman who'd been foolish enough to trust him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they came back, I was sitting between Rachel and Jennifer, both of them holding my hands. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Fraud, identity theft, forgery. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought I'd feel vindicated, satisfied, finally at peace. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired and sad and strangely empty. This didn't give me back the 5 years I'd lost. It didn't erase the shame or the poverty or the nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering what I'd done wrong. It just meant that Michael would face consequences. It just meant the truth was now official, on record, undeniable. At sentencing, I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. I'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find the right words. In the end, I kept it simple. He was convicted on most counts. The sentence was 7 years in federal prison, and he was ordered to pay restitution to me and his other victims. The money would come from the offshore accounts his lawyers tried to claim didn't exist until the prosecutors proved otherwise. 7 years, it wasn't enough. Could never be enough to balance the scales for what he'd done to me and to the other women he'd victimized. But it was something. It was acknowledgement, on record, in a court of law, that I had been wronged, that I wasn't crazy, wasn't reckless, wasn't the villain he'd tried to make me. I was the victim, and I had survived. The restitution money came through about 6 months after the conviction. $47,000 plus interest, plus damages for the emotional distress and the destroyed reputation. It was enough to pay off the debts I'd accumulated in the years since he left, enough to put a down payment on a small house, enough to finally breathe without the weight of financial panic crushing my chest. But the money wasn't what healed me. Not really. What healed me was taking the stand at his trial and telling the truth. What healed me was looking him in the eye and saying out loud in front of a room full of people, "You hurt me, you lied to me, you tried to destroy me, and I am still here." What healed me was Jennifer, who became an unlikely friend through the whole process, who understood in ways my other friends couldn't what it felt like to have your reality shattered by someone you trusted. What healed me was the support group I joined for victims of financial abuse, where I met other women who'd been through similar experiences, who helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have seen it coming, that trust isn't weakness. And what healed me, more than anything, was the Sunday morning about a year after the trial when I woke up early, put on music, and made a pie. My hands remembered the work, the measuring, the mixing, the rolling of dough. It came back to me like breathing, like something I'd always known how to do but had just forgotten for a while. The pie was apple, and it was perfect, and when I pulled it from the oven, the smell filled my entire house and I cried. Not from sadness, but from relief, from the knowledge that Michael had taken so much from me. But he hadn't taken this. He hadn't taken the parts of me that mattered. I started teaching baking classes at a community center. just once a month at first, then more often as word spread. The first class I taught, I was terrified. 6 women showed up, ranging in age from early 20s to late 60s, all looking at me expectantly like I had answers, like I knew what I was doing. "I'm Clara," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "and I'm going to teach you how to make an apple pie." We started with the basics: how to make a proper crust, how to cut butter into flour, how to know when the dough was ready. My hands moved through the familiar motions, and as I worked, I started to relax. This I knew. This I could do. As we worked, the women started talking. One mentioned that she was taking the class to take her mind off a divorce. Another said she'd just lost her job and needed something to feel good about. A young woman in her 20s said simply, "I'm sad, and I heard baking helps." "It does," I said. "I don't know why, but it does." As the weeks went on, the classes became less about baking and more about community. Women would come, many of them carrying their own stories of loss and betrayal and survival, and we would make pies together. We would talk and laugh and sometimes cry, and in the simple meditative work of creating something beautiful and nourishing, we would heal together. One woman, Lisa, had been financially abused by her ex-husband in ways that sounded painfully familiar. She'd come to 3 classes before she felt comfortable sharing her story, and when she did, when she told us about the empty bank accounts and the ruined credit and the shame, I stopped what I was doing and just hugged her. "It's not your fault," I told her. "None of it is your fault." "How did you get through it?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "One day at a time," I said, "some days 1 hour at a time. You do the next right thing, and then the next, and then the next. And eventually you look up and realize you've built a whole new life, piece by piece." The classes grew. We moved from the small kitchen at the community center to a larger space. We started doing special workshops, holiday pies, savory tarts, advanced techniques. Women would bring their daughters, their sisters, their friends. The room would fill with laughter and flour dust and the smell of butter and cinnamon. And in those moments, I felt more like myself than I had in years. I also started writing. Just a blog at first, sharing my story, offering advice to other women going through similar situations. I set it up on a free platform, chose a simple design, and titled my first post, "The Day My Husband Stole Everything and Disappeared." I almost didn't publish it. I must have hovered my cursor over the post button for 10 minutes, terrified of putting my story out into the world, of making myself vulnerable all over again. But I clicked it, and the response was overwhelming. Within a week, I had hundreds of comments from people who'd experienced financial abuse, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, people who'd felt crazy and alone and blamed themselves just like I had. Women wrote to tell me about husbands who controlled every penny, partners who hid assets, boyfriends who ruined their credit. Men wrote too, describing wives or partners who'd exploited them financially, who'd used their trust as a weapon. "I thought I was the only one," one comment said. "Thank you for making me feel less alone." "This is exactly what happened to me," wrote another. "Even the fake spending problem. How did they all read the same playbook?" I started posting regularly. I wrote about the warning signs I'd missed. The way Michael had slowly isolated me from friends, had controlled our finances while making it seem like he was just being responsible, had undermined my confidence in tiny, almost imperceptible ways until I doubted my own memory and judgment. I wrote about how the abuse had been so subtle I didn't even recognize it until it was too late, until I was already trapped in a narrative of my own incompetence. I wrote about the recovery process, about how healing isn't linear, about how some days you feel strong and powerful and other days you can barely get out of bed, about how both of those experiences are valid and normal and okay. I wrote about the shame of having to ask for help, the humiliation of food stamps and social services, the way poverty grinds you down until you can barely remember who you used to be. One post in particular, titled "The Myth of Just Leave," went viral. In it, I wrote about how people always ask why victims don't just leave, why they don't see the signs, why they stay in bad situations. I explained that abuse doesn't start with grand gestures of control. It starts with small things. A comment here, a suggestion there. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already isolated, already doubting yourself, already financially dependent and emotionally drained. The post was shared thousands of times. News outlets picked it up. I started getting interview requests from podcasts, from magazines, from local news stations. Suddenly, my little blog was becoming something bigger than I'd ever imagined. And I wrote about forgiveness, though probably not in the way most people expected. I didn't forgive Michael. I don't think I ever will. What he did was unforgivable, and I don't believe I owe him my absolution. But I forgave myself for trusting him, for not seeing the signs, for all the ways I blamed myself in the aftermath. That forgiveness, the kind you give yourself, that's the one that really matters. Through the blog, I connected with other advocates working in the domestic violence space. They invited me to speak at conferences, to share my story with social workers and therapists and law enforcement. The first time I stood at a podium in front of 100 professionals, I was terrified. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the podium to steady them. But I told my story. I told it honestly, without softening the hard parts, without pretending I'd been stronger or smarter or more resilient than I actually was. And people listened. They took notes. They asked questions. They thanked me for my honesty, for my willingness to be vulnerable in service of helping others. I started consulting with lawmakers on legislation to better protect victims of financial abuse. I sat in committee hearings, telling my story to rooms full of legislators who had the power to change laws, to close loopholes, to make it harder for people like Michael to get away with what they do. Some of them listened, some of them didn't. But I kept showing up, kept telling my truth, kept fighting for the protections I wish had existed when I needed them. The blog grew into something bigger than I ever anticipated. I was invited to speak at conferences about financial abuse, to train social workers and therapists on recognizing the signs, to work with legislators on laws to better protect victims. My story became a tool to help others, and in helping them, I found my purpose. There was one moment, about 3 years after the trial, that crystallized everything for me. I was teaching a baking class, surrounded by a dozen women rolling out pie dough, when one of them asked me a question I'd been asked 100 times before. "Do you ever regret confronting him?" she asked. "Do you wish you'd just let it go and moved on with your life?" I stopped what I was doing and really thought about it. Did I regret it? The confrontation had set off a chain of events that consumed years of my life. The investigation, the trial, the testimony, the media attention. It had been exhausting and re-traumatizing, and there were days I wished I could just forget Michael had ever existed. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. Because if I hadn't confronted him, he would have kept doing this to other women. And I would have spent the rest of my life knowing that, knowing I could have stopped him and didn't. I couldn't live with that. But it was more than that, I realized. The confrontation hadn't been about revenge or justice or even closure. It had been about refusing to be erased, refusing to let someone else's narrative of me stand unchallenged. It had been about looking the man who tried to destroy me in the eye and saying, "I'm still here. You didn't win." 5 years after that night at the gala, I'm living a life I couldn't have imagined during those dark days when Michael first disappeared. I own my house outright, paid for with the restitution money and my earnings from teaching and writing. It's a small house in a quiet neighborhood with a kitchen that has good light and enough counter space for all my baking projects. I have a garden in the backyard where I grow herbs and tomatoes. I have a guest room that Rachel's kids use when they sleep over. I have a home, a real home, that's mine and only mine. I have work that fulfills me, that feels meaningful and important. The baking classes have expanded into a small business. I published a cookbook last year, filled with pie recipes and stories from the women who've come through my classes. The advance was modest, but seeing my name on the cover, holding that physical book in my hands, felt like proof that I'd rebuilt something beautiful from the wreckage Michael had left behind. I have friends who truly know me, who've seen me at my worst and stuck around anyway. Jennifer and I get lunch once a month, an unlikely friendship born from shared trauma but sustained by genuine affection and respect. Laura never stopped believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. The women from my support group have become like family, people who understand the specific kind of pain that comes from being betrayed by someone you trusted completely. And I have peace. Real peace, not the fragile, pretend peace I had in the years immediately after he left. I sleep well at night. I don't jump every time the phone rings. I don't scan crowds for his face anymore. I don't flinch when someone asks about my marriage or my past. I can tell my story without crying, without that old shame rising up to choke me. I'm free. I'm not the same person I was before Michael. That woman is gone, and honestly, I don't miss her as much as I thought I would. She was naive, trusting to a fault, willing to believe the best in people even when the evidence suggested otherwise. The woman I am now is harder, more cautious, less willing to take people at face value. But she's also stronger, more resilient, more certain of her own worth. She knows what she's capable of surviving. She knows her own strength in ways the old Clara never did. Now let me share something important with you. Something I've learned through all of this and through my work with other survivors. Financial abuse is insidious because it's often invisible. Unlike physical abuse, it doesn't leave marks you can see. Unlike emotional abuse, it's sometimes hard to articulate even to yourself what's happening. But the effects are devastating. Research shows that financial abuse is present in 99% of domestic violence cases. 99%. And the health impacts are severe. Victims experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD. The stress of financial insecurity, combined with the trauma of betrayal, creates a toxic cocktail that affects every aspect of life. The signs of financial abuse include a partner who controls all the money, who gives you an allowance, or requires you to account for every penny spent. It includes being excluded from financial decisions, being prevented from working or having your own income, having your name left off accounts or deeds or titles. It includes a partner who runs up debt in your name, who forges your signature, who hides assets. If you're experiencing any of these things, please know it's not your fault. You're not stupid or weak or deserving of this treatment, and there is help available. Organizations like the National Network to End Domestic Violence have financial advocates who can help you understand your options, protect yourself, and plan for safety. And if you're reading this and thinking about someone you know who might be in this situation, reach out. Let them know you see them, you believe them, you're there to support them. Sometimes just knowing that one person believes you can make all the difference. So here we are, at the end of my story. Or maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's just a chapter break. Life keeps going, keeps surprising you with both its cruelties and its kindnesses. I think a lot about that moment at the gala when Michael looked at me and pretended not to know me. At the time, it felt like the ultimate insult, proof that I had meant so little to him that he could just erase me from his memory. But now I see it differently. His inability to acknowledge me, to face what he'd done. That was his weakness, not mine. I'm the one who stood up and told the truth. I'm the one who survived and thrived. I'm the one who took the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned